Hello and welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. I'm your host for today, Joe Nicholson, and I'm joined by my fellow Sunderland writer, James Cockley. James, you've had a day to reflect on Sunderland's 2-1 defeat against Ipswich at the Stadium of Light. Obviously not the result that Tony Mowbray's side wanted. So how are you feeling now after the game yesterday at the Stadium of Light?
Mixed emotions. I think it highlighted a little bit of a lack of experience in Sunderland's squad, which is an issue which everybody's talked about for a long time. Raised some transfer questions as well. I'm sure we'll get into the game in more detail, but for me, Joe, it highlighted the lack of an Ahmad, somebody who can really unlock the door for Sunderland. Obviously, you had Patrick Roberts and Clark on the pitch, and I thought Roberts did well in periods of the game, but he seemed to have 2 or 3 on him, and he didn't have somebody next to him who he could bounce the ball off like he did at times last season with Ahmad. I thought Clark was his usual willing self, but struggled to deliver that real moment of quality. So it was just a frustrating day in attack for Sunderland, I thought.
We'll just quickly run you through what happened. I'm sure you were all aware of what happened through the game, but Sunderland saw a lot of the ball, dominated possession really for most of that first half. Fell behind though right on the stroke of half time when Nathan Broadhead kind of turned a shot past Anthony Patterson. At first, it looked like it hit him with him not really knowing much about it, but then on second viewing, he did quite well to kind of adjust his feet and turn the ball in. Ipswich then went 2-0 up shortly after half time when George Hurst was put through by Broadhead and he made it 2-0. Sunderland then reduced to 10 men when Try Hume was sent off for a second yellow card, but seemed to respond quite well after that with Dan Neil pulling one back with about 4 minutes to go. Then there were 13 minutes of added time and Neil had a shot tipped onto the post by the Ipswich goalkeeper. So Sunderland could have quite easily come away with a point. But obviously, looking at the game, James, what was said yesterday from Tony Mowbray and from Dan Neil, Mowbray was saying for the first kind of 20, 15 minutes, it was kind of one-way traffic in Sunderland's favour. Dan Neil came out and said he felt they dominated for large parts of the game, which I tend to agree with both of them. But as you mentioned before, there just seemed to be that lack of cutting edge. And I think what Ipswich kind of had with Hurst, with Chaplin, and with Broadhead, they had that kind of sharpness up front where it just felt Sunderland lacked that really without, as you said, Ahmad. If you'd put Ross Stewart in that side, I just felt that was kind of the difference between the two teams, even though Sunderland played some good stuff and saw more of the ball.
No, I would agree. First 20 minutes, I thought Sunderland were really good, kept the ball really well. Ekwa pulling the strings magnificently in the midfield. Dan Neil looked good. The only thing I would say that when Sunderland did dominate, I thought Hemia looked very isolated up front. We saw in pre-season. I actually turned to you during the game, didn't I, and said that it's a strange performance this by Hemia because he hasn't really dropped deep. He didn't touch the ball very often, really. Certainly didn't look a goal threat. So perhaps he's been given instructions to maybe occupy the 2 centre-halves. Mowbray mentioned his work rate in his running is something he's still adapting to. But yeah, I agree with that assessment that Sunderland did dominate for large periods, especially the opening 20 minutes. I thought Ipswich throughout the game as a whole, though, had their moments. I thought for a newly promoted side, they were very, very, very good. Nathan Broadhead is an exceptional player and pulled the strings, got into spaces. You know, he plays that 9.5 role really, really well. I like Joe Geldhard, but it would have been interesting to see if Nathan Broadhead had come back to Sunderland last season because he seems to really play that role quite well. Granted, he was playing off a striker. And there's nothing like a goal and an assist to sort of make you wonder if Sunderland missed the boat with Nathan Broadhead. I actually thought that the crucial moment in the game as a whole was Joe Bellingham's miss. Ekwa gets the ball in the middle. It's a good shot. Tests the goalkeeper, which is something Sunderland didn't do enough. The goalkeeper can't hold it. The ball comes out to Ekwa. The goal's gaping. The goalkeeper's not getting there if he hits it on target. And he blazes it over the bar. I think he should do better from that position. But when you watch it back, it is a tough sort of half volley to control that side-footed. Very, very tough chance. I think anybody who's watched football or who's like played football at a basic level would understand that the way that ball's travelling, the angle of it, it is a tough chance, albeit professional footballer probably should do better. And somebody said to me on Twitter, I hope that's not the moment that sort of we look back on in this game. And I think it was a bit of a moment missed. And that the first goal's a killer right before half-time. The second goal's a killer because it's just after half-time. It's that textbook thing, isn't it, Joe, with a 90-minute football match. You don't want to concede sort of either side of half-time. Left Sunderland with a bit of a mountain to climb. I thought in the second half, Ipswich managed it well with Sunderland chasing the game. They had several chances with Sunderland stretched. They could have scored another couple. Yes, Sunderland did hit the post. But I thought Ipswich were probably worth their win in the end. And I was slightly disappointed with Sunderland in a sense that they only really started to get going in the second half when that's 13 minutes of added time. There was a noticeable lift. The crowd,
the red card, the human red card, I thought from there.
The red card, that did rally a little bit after that. But for me, the urgency when that 13 minutes was shown, there was a sort of an audible lift within the stadium and a boost within the team as well. I just would have liked to have seen that come a little bit earlier. I think we sort of went through the motions and perhaps felt a little sorry for ourselves at times. I don't think it's the worst sort of opening performance we've ever seen, and I don't think there's any cause for massive concern just yet. And I actually think Ipswich are a really good side, managed by a really, really good coach in Kieran McKenna, who've got some good players. And I think actually come the end of the season, we might look at this result and think like, Ipswich are a decent team.
Yeah, we kind of saw that last season with Coventry, didn't we? Sunderland played Coventry on the opening day of the season. It was a 1-1 draw. And actually look what Coventry went on and achieved, getting to the playoff final. But I agree with you. I think the start of the second half, I think Sunderland were it was a real sucker punch, wasn't it? Conceding right on the stroke of half time. When Sunderland had, as we said, I think played the better stuff. Perhaps Ipswich had created some of the better chances. There was the one where 09 had to block one off the line, but as you say, that Bellingham
I forgot about that. Yeah,
was a big one. But I just thought in the second half, it was just Sunderland looked a bit kind of flustered, and Ipswich got their second goal, and then there was another moment where Chaplin hit the crossbar, and then Ipswich probably should have had a penalty when Ballard collided with Hurst. But there was another moment actually in the first half when the game was still 0-0 when Jack Clark was clipped. Now I've seen this back this morning. He was clipped by Donatian, and I think Sunderland had a strong claim for a penalty there.
Yeah, I do as well. I actually spoke to I went to university in Swansea with an Ipswich Town supporting friend who I actually met before the match, Matthew. And I was talking to him after the game, and he wasn't impressed with the referee either. He said he'd watched it back and he thought it was a penalty on Clark, but that Ipswich should have had a penalty as well. Yeah. So it was an interesting day for the officials. Mowbray obviously wasn't too happy after the game either. So yeah, sometimes you get them and sometimes you don't. It's interesting actually, like looking at the stats for the game. Sunderland dominated possession. They had more shots on target. And you can look at that and you can say, yeah, Sunderland probably should have won that game. But as you mentioned, Joe, in terms of the clear-cut chances, I think Ipswich could have had two at the end, really, on the break. They clipped the crossbar as well from that long shot. They had the moment with Luke O'Nien, which was an exceptional piece of defending.
I thought he was going to put it in his own net.
An exceptional piece of defending. So in terms of moments on goal, I think Ipswich probably edged that, to be honest. And it just goes to show that the numbers don't always tell the full story. And just on 09, actually, obviously Danny Bart was left out of the starting 11 with Mowbray preferring 09 alongside Ballard. And I thought 09 perhaps became a victim of criticism because Bath was left out and Sunderland had lost and Sunderland conceded 2 goals. But actually, I thought 09 by and large was pretty good. You could argue you could probably rightly argue that Danny Bart's better defensively, he's got more stature, but I think he's been sort of a victim of Bath being left out and Sunderland losing, where perhaps 09 didn't really do too much wrong, and the goal that he saved was an exceptional piece of defending. He captained the side. Would I have started Bath? Probably yes, but I don't actually think 09 did too much wrong. I don't know how you saw that, Joe.
When a player is left out and the team have lost, it's always kind of easy to.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
If so-and-so had have played, it may have been different. I think if you look at the 2 goals, the first one, it's a good run from Broadhead. I think 09 was the closest player to him. But I'm not sure there was much kind of 09 could have done to get in front.
It's an excellent finish by Nathan Broadhead. The ball's coming at him so fast, and he's just dinked it into the net. As you mentioned earlier, we both thought it was a deflection. And it's an exceptional finish by an exceptional player who, if he stays fit, honestly, I think sky's the limit, to be honest, for Nathan Broadhead in terms of the Championship, and maybe even getting back to a Premier League club one day. If he can just keep those hamstrings in order, he's a really, really good player.
Mm-hmm. When you mentioned there with Danny Bart, he was on the bench, and Mowbray said afterwards that it's kind of business as usual. Obviously, we know there's been that transfer interest from Blackburn. There was some reports saying that Bart wasn't going to be in the squad, but he was on the bench yesterday, and then Mowbray confirmed that he's set to play against Crewe in the Carabao Cup. Now, centre-back is a position where Sunderland do have a lot of options with Ballard, with 09, with Danny Bart. Trantis has come in. Jensen Seals as well is going to come back from injury. But do you think at the minute that is the strongest partnership with 09 and Ballard at the back for next week's game against Preston?
Personally, no. I know I've just defended 09 there, but I just think Danny Bart's experience and his leadership is vital to Sunderland. If you look at some of the best periods Sunderland had last season, it was Bath and Ballard, and then when Ballard was out, it was Bath and 09. For the most part, I think his inexperience, his guidance. Not that I'm saying that 09 and Ballard are some sort of headless chickens in defence, because they're not. But I just think sometimes you need that older statesman. He would have been in my team against Ipswich, to be honest. Obviously, that there seems to be something going on behind the scenes in terms of the transfer, tactically as well. Mowbray has mentioned sort of playing out from the back, but yeah, I think Bath can do that at times. He's not one that's just going to grab the ball and hoof it up every time, but he has good defensive instincts, and sometimes a defender's first instinct needs to be to defend and get the ball away. And personally, I think they're two. I think that partnership's really strong, Bath and Ballard. Yeah. I actually remember thinking at one point last season that there wasn't really a better central defensive partnership in the Championship, other than maybe the top 2 or 3, because Bath and Ballard were so strong. Yes, he's a year older now and whatnot, but with that experience with Wolves, helping them to promotion that time ago, his wealth of experience with Stoke City, he'd be in my team. He was Sunderland's player of the season last year. And in regards to that transfer question, I do think sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for. It's very easy to look at a player's age and go, 32, 33, coming up to 34, doesn't fit in with a model. We're not going to be able to recoup any sort of fee for him, so it's worth blooding a younger player, which I can understand that argument to an extent. And it is good to have young players around the club, and it is good to think in terms of succession and who's going to be the next cab off the rank. But at the end of the day, you do need players that can contribute now and who have the experience to bring those young players through. And I think Danny Bath did that exceptionally last year with Ballard. And I know he's not a young player, but with 09 being inexperienced as a Championship centre-back, as he was last season, I think Bath was invaluable to helping them both progress. And I think he could perform a similar role this season. And, he's a fine defender in the Championship as well. And I don't think we should underestimate that. And you could probably argue the same as well with Alex Pritchard and a few of the other squads as well.
Mm-hmm. It kind of links to the next point that I was going to come on to, which was Sunderland's home form. And you kind of touched on it there with the way that Mowbray wants his side to play. The defenders are going to be quite high up the pitch. It's going to be a high line. Perhaps that's the reason why he went with 09 and Ballard yesterday, 2 younger players that maybe a bit more mobile. But we've seen this kind of trend carrying over from last season. Sunderland at home are not as good as they are away from home. I've just got the tables up here. Last season, Sunderland 16th in the division. Their home form, 7 wins, 9 draws, 7 losses. Away from home, they had 11 wins, 6 draws, and 6 losses. And we saw it at times yesterday in the Ipswich game where Sunderland will see a lot of the ball. They will send more men forward, but then they are vulnerable on the counter-attack. We saw that especially towards the end when Sunderland were kind of chasing the game. And it's just a theme that seems to kind of have been cropping up last season and then this season. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Do Sunderland need to try and maybe change their style at home? It's very difficult because naturally a team, even Ipswich, who were quite an attacking team, scored 101 goals in League One last season. They're going to be organised and put men behind the ball. and then pose that threat on the break. And sometimes Sunderland are quite vulnerable from that.
It's very interesting. I do think it is a formational and a sort of stylistic thing. As you mentioned, clubs are going to come to the Stadium of Light and perhaps be prepared to soak up the pressure for 20 minutes because the onus is on Sunderland to play. And that's the sort of football that Sunderland do tend to play. They want to be on the front foot. I really don't think it's a question of... I think that it is a question of pressure, but that's two-pronged. I don't mean that in a sense that Sunderland fans put loads of pressure on the team, because I don't think that exists. I think any footballing crowd in the world can be demanding at times, and rightly so, because you pay your money. I don't particularly see Sunderland fans as any more demanding as any other club in the land. I actually think on the whole, Sunderland fans are really supportive and understanding of a fairly young team at the moment, and were throughout last season and will continue to be and do so this season. But I think the pressure does come from maybe just the magnitude of the stage, the amount of eyes on you, the 42,000 people or whatever the attendance was, the fact that it's such a large club, the fact that they're so young and inexperienced in places, that perhaps that does weigh on some people's minds, and perhaps they do feel that the pressure is off a little bit more away from home. And they can be the sort of underdogs that upset the apple cart a little bit away from home, and they can absorb the pressure because the onus isn't necessarily on them. So I think that there is an element of pressure, but not from Sunderland fans. I don't think there's an element of pressure from there. And I think, Sunderland fans, when they get behind the team, which more often than not they do, you can propel the team to heights that maybe weren't achievable before. Look at the Luton Town game at home in the playoff last season. I thought the Sunderland fans were brilliant there and sort of helped the team find another gear. So I do think it's psychological, but I don't think Sunderland fans are hindering Sunderland. But then there is the sort of stylistic and the formation question as well. And it's a shame, because I think the Stadium of Light could and should be a real fortress and a real asset playing in front of that crowd. And it's up to the team and Tony Mowbray to sort of harness that and deal with that and get used to it. And Sunderland's stated aim is to knock on the door for promotion this season and next season. And if they're going to do that, then, as you mentioned, those stats, Joe, they're going to have to be sorted out and pretty quickly, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it's definitely something they'll want to improve, the home form. But as we mentioned before, I think kind of the difference between the two teams was what was there in the final third with Ipswich, what they had up front. They looked very sharp. Sunderland, in contrast, Hemir was up front. It's his first competitive game in the Championship. Joe Bellingham played as a number 10. And although he played there for Birmingham last season, doesn't have many kind of goals and assists. So I think when you just kind of took, obviously, Ahmad out of the team and Stewart's, I know he didn't play as much last season because of the injuries, but if you brought them back into the side, it could have been a completely different picture. But what did you kind of make of the most attacking players in Bellingham and Hemir, both making their debuts? I thought Bellingham looked quite bright for most of the first half. I thought he pressed well. I thought he had some good touches. As we said before, he missed that kind of golden chance, which could have made it 1-0. And perhaps maybe he doesn't offer as much of a goal threat as perhaps when Bradley Dack gets fit, for example. He's a player, when he was fit and firing at Blackburn, would chip in with 15 goals a season, and perhaps that's what Sunderland are lacking.
Yeah, I really liked the performance from Joe Bellingham, to be honest, especially when Sunderland were on the front foot. I thought in possession he was excellent. He's clearly quite intelligent. There was a lovely little step over in the first half where the ball was played towards him and he let it run for Clark, and it presented a fairly decent opportunity. I thought that was exceptional awareness, very smart of a 17-year-old. I thought on the ball he looked good. He showed a good few flicks. He tried to penetrate, which is always good for a number 10 or an attacking player to want to try and play that pass. Hemir, again, as we mentioned earlier, it was interesting that he didn't really try and drop deep much and link the play. He didn't get too much in the way of service, but on the flip side of that, he didn't really work too hard to make himself anything either. I just think of Ross Stewart, and yes, it is tough to compare Hemir to Ross Stewart, because Ross Stewart's a different question altogether at the moment, a different profile of player, different gravy really. But Ross Stewart really runs the channels, helps create. His work rate's exceptional. He might touch the ball 10 times, but 7-8 times are meaningful touches, and he makes the very most of what he's got and drags opponents left, right, and centre. I didn't really see much of that sort of old school classic centre forward work from him here. Although he did, stretch the pitch and pin the two centre halves back. I think he really needs to learn how to use his physicality and his size. But at the end of the day, he's a 17-year-old kid coming over from Portugal in a new league, in a new team, in a new country with a new language. It's going to be extremely tough for him. I've no doubt he'll come good eventually. I like what we saw of him in pre-season. It's still very early days. You must note that as well, with all the challenges I've just mentioned that he's facing. But for me, I think it just highlights the need for added depth in the striker position, added depth in terms of experience, added depth in terms of quality, added depth in terms of the different types of strikers that are out there and the different options that could provide for Tony Mowbray's side. Because Joe, I mean, in the second half, Mowbray took Hamir off. His reasoning for that was he hasn't played too much football, and we want to sort of, we don't want to injure him early on because he's just such a young kid. But when Hamir went off, there was no striker on the bench to come on and affect the game and provide another option. The club have been unlucky to a degree because Mayenda has been injured and he was brought to the club, but he's only another, I think he's 17. 17 or 18 himself. So Sunderland need options, and it's been the same in the striking department, with a caveat of a little bit of bad luck here and there. But I think fans will drastically lose patience soon if that striking question isn't really sorted. But there were positives there from Bellingham. And I think Hamir will come good with time. It's, in an ideal world, Hamir probably wouldn't have been starting against Ipswich Town. Hamir would have made his debut against Crewe. But fate has had it that's not happened, and Sunderland haven't got that experienced striker through the door yet. But you have to caveat that with it's an extremely competitive market, isn't it? The striking one.
Well, this is it's the dilemma they've got now, isn't it? And you would think that there will be at least one Premier League loan probably coming in before the end of the month.
You would hope so.
When kind of those players become available, when Premier League clubs have had that first few weeks to kind of assess their squad and think, okay, this player can now go out on loan, and Sunderland, you would think, is a good place for a young player or even a slightly more experienced player to come out on loan and get regular game time. But it's definitely that striker position is the one where they lack depth. I mean, we expect Mowbray to probably make 10, 11 changes for the Crewe game on Tuesday. And if Hamir drops out, as we've seen in pre-season, someone like Jewison Bennett's going to have to lead the line, and that's not ideal for him to be your centre forward.
It's not. And I don't want to bedwet or anything like that, but in terms of the transfer window, time is actually rapidly running out. It's the 7th of August now. We praise Sunderland, rightly so, for getting some good business done early. Obviously, they've concluded the signing of Dak since then and Mayanda, but it's the deadline isn't that far away. It will be on us before we know it. Do you want to go into deadline day with this issue still a thing? Absolutely not. But whether it gets sorted or not is an entirely different matter.
Mm-hmm. That's probably the main position. I think a lot of people would say Sunderland needs to strengthen is up front. I think another area, probably central midfield. I think with Jay Matete's injury, I'm just kind of writing down potential predicted lineup for the Crewe game, and potentially if you take out Neil and Ekwar out of midfield, maybe Rig comes in there, but then kind of who else is there to play? Obviously with Evans out injured and with Matete out injured, Embleton out injured as well. There's not really a natural kind of central midfielder that could drop in there. So if Mowbray's going to make 11 changes, as we saw him do for the Hartlepool friendly last week, he played Niall Huggins in a central midfield role. You're kind of moving players out of position, and that wasn't really ideal. And we saw what happened in that Hartlepool game. Sunderland lost 5-2, and only a friendly, but it'll be interesting to see kind of how he approaches the Crewe game and how many players he kind of puts out of position, and could again maybe highlight a lack of strength and depth in certain areas.
Yeah, definitely. And I thought against Ipswich, obviously, Dan Neil got the goal and hit the post. He did get caught on the blind side once or twice, but I thought it was another positive performance from Dan Neil, who was a player that I like. It was interesting that him and Ekwar sort of dovetailed a little bit. Ekwar was brilliant on the ball, but
I think that suits both of them.
Yeah, one would go forward while the other sat. Whereas last season when Dan Neil was sort of pigeonholed into that 6 role because Corey Evans was injured. He couldn't get forward too much, but I sort of thought with those two there was a more of an understanding where one stays, the other one will go, and vice versa. And Ekwar's so good on the ball. I'm such a fan of his, and I think he's gonna turn into a great player. But you're completely right. Behind those two, obviously, you've got Corey Evans, who's injured. He's a more of a natural number 6. Sunderland probably could have done with somebody like that yesterday. Jay Matete is injured. He was having a good pre-season. We're still even not really sure what his specific role in the midfield is, but he's another body that's out. Could Joe Bellingham drop a bit further back? Probably, but
yeah. But then obviously started the game.
Well, this is it exactly. He started the game against Ipswich, so he's surely not going to start against Crewe. Alex Pritchard, could he drop a little bit further back? It's not really his game. I don't think. Could he do it against Crewe for a game? Probably. And then as you rightly say, against Hartlepool, you were looking at Huggins in the middle at one point. Gooch went in the middle at one point. Ellis Taylor's another player who could possibly start in centre midfield, but it's not really his natural position. So yeah, I think definitely a centre midfielder. And it's interesting actually, just looking at the squad list now, is that sort of the sort of heir apparent to Ahmad, we were told, was Lahaji. Obviously, he's left, but he looked more of a winger to me in pre-season anyway. Nevertheless, he's gone. But then it was also sort of mooted that Abdullah Bar was the number 10. He started playing off the left in pre-season, and he came on and occupied the left wing role there again. So that midfield spot, but also that number 10 spot as well. Sunderland do have some good players for that position, but I'm not really sure who the new Ahmad is, or whether we're going to even get a new Ahmad type player. So there are still some questions. We'll have added depth to certain positions, and rightly so. And I think that will benefit Sunderland long term. But in terms of quality, you could argue that maybe Sunderland are slightly weaker than they were last year. The caveat to that is that players will take time to develop as the season goes on. You look at last season, the likes of Trey Hume, emerged as this brilliant player. The same with someone like Aji Alisi, even Ekwar towards the back end of last season. You sort of reach a point in the season and you start thinking, actually, these are first team options, and everything starts to look quite exciting. So we're still sort of in the early days of evaluating this squad, but I do think it is short on quality at the moment, to be brutally honest. And I think it's short on quality in the context of what Sunderland are setting out to do this season. The stated aim, as I mentioned earlier, is to build on the 6th position and get knocked out in the playoff semi-final, and go one better and get promoted. If it was last season and we were just sort of happy to be back in the Championship and sort of not low expectations, because we all wanted the team to do well and we all thought the team could do well, but there wasn't that pressure. But Sunderland performed well last season. It was an enjoyable season. But now expectations have increased, and in that context, I think the squad does lack a little bit of quality.
I mean, clearly the squad has got a lot of kind of young, energetic, technical players in it. That's the way the club have recruited. But I just think there's, in certain positions, there is lack of options there. You mentioned the number 10.
Speciality, isn't it? Specialist positions.
I mean, in the number 10 position now, you've got Bellingham played there yesterday. You could bring Dak in there. You could bring Pritchard in there. 3 good options for that position. But then, as we said before, in central midfield, Neil and Ekwar are a good first choice pairing. But behind that, with the players out injured, there is a lack of depth. And the same with the forwards options as well. Lahaji's now been sold over the weekend. It sounded like Sunderland got quite a good deal there from what Christian Speakman was saying on the club website. But he was another player that was kind of being tipped to kind of step up this season, with Ahmad leaving, perhaps like someone like Hume did last season. Obviously different position, but he'd been there a little bit of time and then stepped up last season. That's probably what Sunderland thought would happen with Lahaji this season, but now he's been sold. So Sunderland probably need to replace him, because although, again, Clark and Roberts are good first choice options for those wide positions, they may not be available for every game. So Sunderland maybe need to now bring in another option. But what are your kind of thoughts on Lahaji being sold? And Sunderland probably need to now bring in another winger as well as the positions we've already mentioned.
Yeah, I think it underlines that actually although Christian Speakman and Stuart Harvey's hit rate with signings has been relatively good, I don't think anybody could argue that. The likes of Clark Roberts coming to the club, Ekwar looks a shrewd sign, and they brought Danny Bath to the club, they brought Cirque and Hume to the club, Agi Alisi, Corey Evans came to the club under them. They managed to get the Ahmad loan done. But every now and again, you're going to get a player that doesn't work, whose face doesn't fit, and that they've got wrong. And I think Isaac Lahaji was probably one of them. I think he could have perhaps developed into a player, but you have to question his hunger and his sort of aspirations that he's gone over to Qatar, probably offered a good financial package, which is hard to turn down. But yeah, in terms of him being the next Ahmad and the next number 10, it hasn't turned out that way. And actually, having watched him in pre-season, I'm not sure he was ever that really. But every transfer, I suppose, has to be justified, and perhaps when I'm sure he was brought to the club in good faith. But yeah, it's one of those that just hasn't worked out. But you could argue in real terms that it's been a success, because he was brought to the club for a fee, and he's been sold for a bigger fee. So in terms of that side of the things, you could argue that Sunderland have come out with a win there.
Yeah, as you say, not every transfer is going to work out. And if you look at the signings that Sunderland have made, a lot of them have worked out very well, but not all of them are going to work out. I think that's just natural. It's going to happen at any club. But just to kind of round off the podcast, Sunderland, as we said, do play against Crewe on Tuesday night. So kind of what are you looking forward to seeing? A few new signings will be involved. I expect Triantis, Dak, Bishop will probably start in goal. Probably Dak's the one that a lot of Sunderland fans are kind of excited to see what he's all about, probably playing in that number 10 position.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think Mowbray mentioned after the Mallorca game that the Crewe was going to be the game for Dak. So hopefully, unless he's picked up an injury that we're unaware of, he'll play. Expect to see Jervis and Bennett probably up front, which, as you mentioned, it's a tough sell and a tough role for him. I know he scored against Hartlepool, but it's not his position. He's better off the wing, and I think it would be nice to see him play in his actual position at some point. You'd expect Lyndon Gooch to play. Abdullah Bar will probably play. Interestingly, Chris Rigg is probably going to start, so that'll be his first sort of senior start in a Sunderland shirt, I'd imagine. Niall Huggins probably going to play as well. As you say, Nathan Bishop debut. Give Anthony Patterson a rest. It'll be an interesting game, actually, because will the side be that different to the one that lost 5-2 against Hartlepool? Probably not, because Tony Mowbray doesn't have that many more options, really, does he? So you'll probably see Bishop and Dak come in. So who started that game against Hartlepool? It was Young, wasn't it? And then Patterson came on. So you'll have Bishop coming in, and then obviously Lahaji's not here anymore, so it'll be Dak. So that would be my predicted 11. And then, a few of those players will have points to prove after that Hartlepool debacle, really. I know it was pre-season, but, to lose 5-2 to a National League side was poor. Interesting, Joe, what the formation will be, because they started that Hartlepool game with a back three or a back five, however you want to call it, with Zach Johnson in there. That's another interesting caveat to the game against Crewe, which is a very quick turnaround. Playing Sunday, Tuesday that's a bit of a nightmare. That.
Well, that's why I kind of think seems likely they'll make 11 changes. I don't think you'd want to risk a player that's played against Ipswich on Sunday evening and then play them again on Tuesday night against Crewe, with potentially them picking up an injury. But yeah, the formation will be an interesting one. I tend to think he'd probably try and stick with the 4-2-3-1. He went, as you said, with a back three against Hartlepool to try and fit Zach Johnson in, because that was his natural position as a centre back, and it didn't really work. But I think the problem there is the midfield options, because, as you said, if you take out Neil and Ekwar, who's then going to play in midfield? Potentially Rigg, potentially Pritchard drops back, but again, you're kind of moving players out of position. So that's why it's a kind of Matete's injury now is looking like quite a bit of a blow, because you're kind of lacking that depth in central midfield. But we'll see what he goes with on Tuesday, and then Sunderland are away at Preston next weekend on Saturday, their first Championship away game of the season. So you can find all kind of build up to Tuesday's game against Crewe over on the SAFC section of the Sunderland Echo website. And then we'll have a reaction from that game and then build up to the Preston game next weekend. So you can find all the latest Sunderland news over on the website. So once again, thanks a lot for joining us on the latest episode of the Raw podcast, and we'll see you next time.